Imagine you are the embodiment of ancient power. Scales harder than steel, breath a hellish fire, your roar shaking mountains. You are lord of the skies, a living legend. But every dawn, instead of pride, you feel only a cold clench in your chest. Not the chill of your stone den, but the premonition of spears soon to pierce flesh, the baying of hounds, and the hate-filled eyes of humankind. Therefore, your life is not an epic, but an endless flight. Majesty becomes a curse, strength the excuse for the hunt. They call you monster. They paint terrifying tales. But do they ever pause to wonder who the true monster is in this relentless, cruel chase? It truly sucked to be a dragon. And this is merely a glimpse of the agony you're about to witness. Do you dare look deeper into the darkness where the roar of truth awaits? And that was the tragic, rarely heard story of a dragon hunted. From those terrifying dawns, filled with the sound of hounds and constant fear, to the burden of greatness where very power and majesty became a curse. We've dived deep into that endless hunt, haven't we? Where every but, and therefore, was a step in a deadly dance. Could you feel the helplessness as such a mighty creature faced human cunning and traps? Which moment in the hunt struck you the hardest? Let me know in the comments. The loneliness, the paranoia, the despair, a terrible price for being different. Did images of modern dragons, of individuals or groups marginalized and misunderstood, flash in your mind? We also deconstructed myths, examining who the real monster was. And most importantly, we found echoes of this tale in our world, realizing we can unknowingly be knights or empathize with hidden dragons. Did that final message resonate with you? That the choice is ours, to wield the sword of judgment or extend the hand of understanding. If this story, these insights, gave you a new perspective, a moment of reflection, or even a spark of empathy, please hit that like button to show your support. It truly means the world. And if you want to continue exploring profound stories like this, analyzing more why it sucked to be X, or simply join the journey of seeking empathy and valuable lessons, please subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss what's next. What did you find most sucked about being a hunted dragon? And more importantly, what's the biggest lesson you're taking away after all this? Share your thoughts below. I'd love to read them and connect. Thank you for listening and pondering all the way to the end. Your attention is a gift. See you next time. Part 1. The Gilded Cage of Dragon. The Burden of Magnificence. So, you've glimpsed the dawn through my eyes, a tapestry, a ryuzu of dread, and a weary, oh so, familiar resignation. You've felt that primal shiver, the one that isn't born of cold, but of a knowledge etched into the very marrow of my ancient bones. They are coming. Always. But before we delve further into the blood-soaked ballad of the hunt, before you truly understand the gnawing terror of being the quarry, you must first grasp what it means to be dragon. Not the fire, breathing caricature scrawled onto tavern signs, or the avaricious beast hoarding gold in children's fables. No. I speak of the reality, the intricate, often agonizing truth of our existence. Because, you see, much of why it sucked so profoundly to be us stemmed directly from the very things that made us, well, us. Our magnificence was, in itself, a magnificent curse. Picture this. Scales, not like the delicate, shimmering adornments of a fish, but like 1,000 interlocking shields, each one a masterpiece of natural engineering, forged in the geothermal heart of the world, cooled by 1,000,000 mountain winds. They possess a resilience that human smiths can only dream of replicating. Run your hand across them if you dared, and if I allowed, and you'd feel a coolness, a smoothness that belies their incredible strength. They can deflect a poorly aimed arrow, turn aside a clumsy sword thrust. They are our first, and often last, line of defense, a legacy of survival. But this very invulnerability, this natural armor, is a beacon. It screams challenge to every pint-sized hero wannabe critereos for a shortcut to glory. It whispers, impenetrable, and therefore worthy of penetration. Each scale, a testament to eons of evolution, becomes another reason for some overzealous knight to test his newest dragon-slaying lance. A lance probably crafted with more enthusiasm than skill, but no less deadly for its wielder's conviction. Therefore, what should be a source of security becomes a magnet for aggression. It's like wearing the world's most ostentatious suit of armor and then wondering why every brawler in the kingdom wants a piece of you. It sucked. Then there are the claws. The claws. Long, obsidian, sharp, capable of rending stone or felling ancient oaks with a single, contemptuous swipe. They are tools, primarily. Tools for gripping treacherous cliff faces during a stormy ascent. Tools for unearthing stubborn roots when sustenance is scarce. Tools for digging out a new den when the last one became compromised. They are an extension of our will, precise and powerful. But in the terrified eyes of a human, these are not tools of survival. They are weapons of mass destruction, instruments of pure, unadulterated malice. A flick of my wrist, an unconscious twitch while I sleep, could be misinterpreted as an act of aggression. Therefore, every natural movement is fraught with the potential for misunderstanding, for escalation. I could be merely scratching an itch on a mountainside, and some distant shepherd, convinced I'm about to trigger an avalanche, to devour his flock, will be hightailing it to the nearest baron, babbling about the demon dragon's unholy rampage. It sucked. This constant, exhausting need to be hyper, aware of one's own physicality, lest it be weaponized by the fear of others. And the breath. Oh, gods, the breath. That most infamous, most sensationalized attribute. The inferno that dwells within. It's not something we conjure with a theatrical flourish, despite what the bards sing. It's a complex biological process, a byproduct of our unique metabolism, a volatile cocktail of gases ignited by an internal spark. It can be a weapon, yes. When cornered, when our young are threatened, when pushed beyond the limits of an already frayed endurance, the fire comes. It is primal, a desperate, all-consuming roar of defiance. But more often, it's a nuisance. An unexpected sneeze can scorch a patch of unfortunate undergrowth. A particularly hearty yawn can set nearby icicles weeping. And God forbid we get indigestion. After a questionable meal, the resulting belch could inadvertently signal our location to trackers miles away. Therefore, this incredible power, this ultimate deterrent, is also a constant liability. It's like carrying a live volcano in your chest, one that might erupt at the most inopportune moments, usually when you're trying to be inconspicuous, which, for a creature my size, is already a Herculean task. The sheer effort of not accidentally incinerating something was, frankly, exhausting. It sucked. Let's not forget flight. The boundless freedom of the open sky, the world spread out beneath you like a rumpled carpet, the wind a symphony against your wings. It should be glorious. And sometimes, in fleeting, stolen moments, it is. To soar above the clouds, to dance with the storm-laden winds, to feel the sun warm upon your back when the world below is shrouded in mist. These are the moments that almost make the rest bearable. But these wings, membranes of leathered muscle stretched taut over bone spars thicker than a man's torso, are also giant, unmissable targets. They cast shadows that betray our passage. Their downbeat can be heard for leagues if the air is still. And while they offer escape, they also make us visible, vulnerable silhouettes against the vast canvas of the sky, perfect for a well-aimed ballista bolt or a volley of enchanted arrows. Therefore, the very gift that should symbolize ultimate liberty often feels like painting a giant bullseye on your own back. You're never truly free when you know, with every beat of your wings, that somewhere below, eyes are tracking you, bows are being strung, and curses are being muttered. It sucked the joy right out of the sky. And then there's the mind, the intellect. We are not the brutish, instinct-driven beasts of human folklore. We live for centuries, millennia even. We watch empires rise and crumble to dust. We see mountains erode and rivers change their course. This vast expanse of time gifts us with a perspective, a depth of understanding that few creatures can comprehend. We are the silent, often unwilling, historians of this world. We have our own languages, complex and nuanced, filled with the echoes of forgotten ages. We observe, we learn, we remember. Beauty, what good is wisdom when there is no one to share it with, or when those you might attempt to communicate with see only a monster, a threat to be silenced? What solace is there in understanding the cyclical nature of history when your own kind is being systematically driven towards extinction within one of those cycles? Therefore, our long lives and keen intellects often serve only to deepen our awareness of our own tragic predicament. We are acutely conscious of what we are losing, of the injustice of it all. It's like being a scholar trapped in a burning library, able to read every precious tome, but powerless to save a single one from the flames. This profound, isolating intelligence, it truly, deeply sucked. This connection to the ancient magic of the world, if your particular brand of dragon mythology allows for it, was another double-edged sword. We might feel the pulse of the earth beneath our claws, understand the whispers of the wind, or draw power from lee lines. B-U-T. This very attunement often made us targets for those who sought to exploit or eradicate such magic, fearing what they could not control. Therefore, a sacred bond became another vulnerability, another reason to be hunted by zealous witch hunters or power-hungry sorcerers who saw us not as part of nature's tapestry, but as a resource to be plundered or an abomination to be cleansed. Even the simple act of existing, of needing sustenance, became a point of contention. We are large creatures. We require a significant intake of food. In a world teeming with life, this shouldn't be an issue. We are apex predators, yes, but like the wolf or the great cat. We have a role in the natural order, culling the weak, keeping populations in check. But as human settlements encroached, As forests were felled for farmland, and mountains were mined for their ore, our traditional hunting grounds dwindled. A deer taken from a royal forest, a bullock strayed too far from the herd, these became depredations. Acts of aggression, further proof of our inherent evil. Therefore, the basic need to eat, to survive, was twisted into a justification for our persecution. It's hard to argue your case as a misunderstood guardian of ecological balance when a terrified farmer is pointing at the remains of his prize, winning pig, and screaming for the king's knights. Every meal became a gamble, every hunt a potential spark for conflict. It sucked to be perpetually hungry and simultaneously accused of gluttony and malice. And the infamous dragon's hoard. This, perhaps, is one of the most infuriating, most tragically misunderstood aspects of our supposed nature. Do humans honestly believe we have some innate, draconic avarice, a burning need to sleep upon piles of gold and jewels? The notion is ludicrous. Consider this: our dens are vast, ancient caverns, often the only places large enough and remote enough to offer some semblance of safety. Over centuries, even millennia, these caverns become cluttered. Civilizations rise and fall. Armies march and are defeated. Treasures are lost, hidden, or simply forgotten. And where do these remnants often end up? Swept by floods into riverbeds that feed into subterranean systems, buried in landslides, or deliberately concealed by humans themselves in remote caves, only for the hiders to meet an untimely end. We choose these layers for security, for shelter. Inevitably, over time, shiny, man-made objects accumulate. A glint of gold in the torchlight of an intruding harrow is all it takes. Therefore, our desire for a safe place to rest our weary heads is perversely twisted into evidence of insatiable greed. We are not misers. We are, at worst, indifferent curators of lost property. Yet, this misunderstanding has probably cost more dragon lives than any other single factor. The allure of easy riches, guarded by a fearsome beast, is a siren song too potent for most humans to resist. It sucked to be killed not for what you did, but for what others imagined you possessed. So you see, our very being, our strength, our size, our longevity, our supposed wealth, even our intelligence, every single attribute that defined us as dragon, was systematically reframed, twisted, and used as a justification for our persecution. Our magnificence was not a shield, but a target. Our ancient wisdom was not a gift, but a silent burden. Our natural defenses were interpreted as unprovoked aggression. It was a gilded cage, this existence, beautiful, powerful, awe-inspiring from the outside. But from within, it was a lonely, terrifying, and deeply, deeply unfair place to be. And this, my friend, was all before the knights even unsheathed their swords. This was just the baseline, the everyday suck of being the last of a dying kind in a world that had decided you no longer deserved to exist. Part 2. The endless hunt. So, you've begun to understand the gilded cage, the inherent suck factor woven into the very fabric of our draconic being. You've seen how our strengths were twisted into justifications, our nature perversely reframed as monstrous. But that, as I said, was merely the overture. The true, gut-wrenching, soul-crushing misery began when the abstract fear and loathing of humankind manifested into a very real, very sharp, and very persistent pointy end of a spear Therefore, let us now step into the blood-soaked arena of the hunt itself, this never-ending, exhausting ballad of terror and pursuit, where every beat was a potential death knell. It rarely started with a direct confrontation, not if they were smart, and sometimes, regrettably, they were. It began, as it did this morning, with a whisper on the wind, a tremor in the earth, a scent that didn't belong, the distant baying of hounds, that accursed nerve. Shredding sound was often the first herald of doom. Bred for generations, these dogs possessed an unnerving tenacity, their noses capable of discerning our faintest spoor even days old, across rock and water. They were the vanguard, the outriders of human malice. You'd hear them, a faint, almost musical chorus at first, like a perverse hunting horn played by fate itself. But as the minutes, or hours, crawled by, that chorus would swell, grow closer, its individual yelps and barks coalescing into a singular, terrifying wave of sound that promised pursuit, pain, and ultimately, the gleeful shouts of their masters. Therefore, even before a single human form was sighted, the psychological warfare had begun. The constant, underlying thrum of anxiety would ratchet up, tightening its icy grip around your heart, making every shadow seem to move. Every rustle of leaves sound like an approaching footfall. Sleep, already a precious and fleeting commodity, became an impossibility. Then came the men themselves. Not always the shining knights in their resplendent, albeit impractical, armor that the minstrels so loved to sing about. Oh no, often it was a motley crew, grim-faced peasants armed with pitchforks and a burning desire for revenge for some imagined slight. A missing sheep, a patch of scorched barley that was probably struck by lightning, hardened mercenaries whose loyalty lay solely with the jingle of coin promised from the dragon's hoard, or by a grateful and usually terrified local lord, and yes, sometimes the knights, young, eager ones, their eyes gleaming with the promise of glory, their heads filled with heroic sagas, utterly convinced they were doing the gods' own work. Or older, more cynical ones, their armor dented, their faces etched with the wariness of too many campaigns, who hunted us not for glory, but because it was their trade, their grim profession. A truly charming assortment. Their tactics varied. Sometimes, if they knew our lair, they'd attempt a siege. They'd block the entrance with boulders, try to smoke us out with noxious, burning herbs, a truly unpleasant experience, I assure you, akin to having your sinuses scoured with molten sulfur. They'd set traps, deep pits concealed with flimsy branches, or massive nets woven from steel cable, strong enough to momentarily entangle even a creature of my size. These were often more an annoyance than a true threat if you were wary. But an annoyance could quickly become deadly if you were already weakened, or if they used it as a distraction for a more direct assault. Therefore, you could never afford to underestimate even the most seemingly crude of their preparations. A moment of complacency, a flicker of arrogance in your own strength, could be your undoing. The direct assaults were, of course, the most harrowing. Imagine the scene. You're cornered, perhaps in a narrow canyon or a den with only one exit. The air is thick with the stench of their sweat, their fear, and their burning torches. The noise is a cacophony, the clang of steel, the roar of orders, the frenzied barking of dogs, and their own battle cries. often invoking a bewildering array of deities they believed would favor their murderous endeavor. You'd try to reason, perhaps, in the early days. A warning roar, a display of fire carefully aimed to intimidate, not to incinerate. You'd hope, against all accumulated experience, that this time, they might see reason, might understand you only wished to be left alone. But your roar, to them, was not a warning. It was a challenge, a confirmation of your monstrous nature. Your carefully controlled burst of flame was not a deterrent. It was an unprovoked attack. Therefore, every attempt at de-escalation was invariably met with increased aggression. It was a dialogue of the deaf, spoken in a language of violence where only one side truly wished for peace. They would come at you in waves. The peasants, driven by fear or a misplaced sense of duty, would charge first, their pitchforks and rusty swords comically inadequate against your hide. A sweep of your tail, a dismissive snort of smoke, would usually send them scattering. But their purpose was not to defeat you. It was to harry you, to distract you, to probe for weaknesses, and to allow the more skilled combatants to maneuver into position. Therefore, while individually insignificant, their sheer numbers and relentless, buzzing, fly, persistence could wear you down, forcing you to expend precious energy, making you a less formidable opponent for those who followed. Then the knights, or the seasoned mercenaries, would advance, often under the cover of archers. Arrows, hundreds of them, would rain down. Most would clatter harmlessly off your scales, but a lucky shot, or one aimed with chilling precision by a master bowman, could find a chink, the softer underbelly, the thinner membrane of a wing, or, gods forbid, an eye. And some arrows were not mere wood and steel. They were tipped with poisons that burned in your veins, or enchanted to seek out those vulnerable spots with an unholy accuracy. Therefore, you were forced into a constant, defensive posture, twisting and turning, trying to present your most armored surfaces, while simultaneously trying to identify and neutralize the most immediate threats. It was like trying to conduct a symphony in the midst of an earthquake. And the lances. Ah, the lances. Great, tree, trunk-sized poles of ash or oak, tipped with a yard of cruelly barbed steel, often blessed by some local priest to imbue them with holy, dragon-slaying power. They'd come at you on horseback, if the terrain allowed, hoping to use the momentum of their charge to drive that terrible point deep into your flesh. You could incinerate the horse and rider with a well-aimed blast, but to do so meant exposing yourself, perhaps for a fatal second, to another attacker flanking you. Or they'd work in teams, on foot, using their numbers to try and pin you, to create an opening for one of their comrades to make that devastating thrust. Therefore, every defensive move had to be calculated, every offensive burst of flame or snap of your jaws weighed against the potential repercussions from a dozen other assailants. It was a brutal, ugly, and utterly exhausting business. You might be stronger, faster in the air, and possess a weapon of unparalleled destructive power. But they had numbers. They had relentless, unthinking determination fueled by fear and greed. They had cunning, and they were not above using the most underhanded tactics. They would target your young if they found them, knowing that a parent's protective instinct often overrode all caution. They would use captured members of your own kind, if any were so unfortunate as bait their cries of pain a lure into a carefully laid ambush. Therefore, the fight was never truly fair, never on your terms. It was a constant struggle against a tide of hatred that sought to drown you. Sometimes you'd win. You'd drive them back, leaving a trail of scorched earth and broken bodies. The survivors would flee, their bravado replaced by a primal terror. You'd stand, panting, smoke coiling from your nostrils, your body aching, perhaps wounded, but alive. For now. But these victories were always Pyrrhic. They cost you energy. They often cost you the sanctuary of your lair, now revealed and undoubtedly soon to be revisited by an even larger, angrier force. And they always deepened the hatred, fueled more stories of your savagery, and ensured that the next hunt would be even more determined, more vicious. Therefore, even in victory, there was a bitter taste of defeat, a knowledge that you had only bought yourself a temporary reprieve, not true peace. And what if you didn't want to fight? What if, weary beyond measure of the endless cycle of violence, you simply tried to flee? That, too, was a torment. To take to the skies, your powerful wings beating against the air, seeking the sanctuary of distance and altitude. But as mentioned, those wings made you a conspicuous target. Archers with longbows capable of astonishing range would track your flight. Men on swift horses would follow your shadow on the ground, relentlessly pursuing, waiting for you to tire, for a moment of weakness. And even if you outdistanced them, where could you truly go? Every mountain range, every secluded valley, was potentially already known, or soon to be discovered. Therefore, flight was not freedom. It was merely a postponement of the inevitable confrontation. A desperate, draining exodus with no promised land at its end. The sheer, unadulterated injustice of it all was perhaps the most crushing burden. You, a creature of ancient lineage, a being of immense power, and often profound wisdom, hunted like a rabid dog by these ephemeral, short-lived creatures who swarmed like ants, driven by motives you could barely comprehend, let alone respect. You had done nothing to provoke this, beyond the simple, unforgivable sin of existing as something different, something powerful, something they feared. But fear, in the human heart, so often curdles into hatred, and hatred demands an object, a scapegoat. And we, with our fearsome beauty and terrifying might, were the perfect candidates. Therefore, we were condemned not for our actions, but for our very nature. It was a cosmic joke, played out in blood and fire, and we were its unwilling punchline. It sucked beyond the telling of it. This constant, unmerited persecution, this life lived under a perpetual death sentence for a crime we never committed. This relentless pressure, this unending state of siege, shaped us. It had to. How could it not? Some dragons, it is said, became as savage and cruel as the humans believed them to be, their hearts hardened by endless betrayal and loss, their fire fueled by a rage born of despair. A self-fulfilling prophecy, a tragedy penned by human hands. Others simply gave up, their spirits broken, allowing the hunters their grim prize without a fight, wary of the struggle. And some, like myself, learned to live in the shadows, to become ghosts in our own lands. Forever vigilant, forever fleeing, our lives a testament to the enduring, soul-wearying suckiness of being the hunted. And the hunt, my friend, was far from over. It was merely a daily, hourly, minutely reality. Part 3. The scars that never healed the lingering agony, the immediate terror of the hunt, that desperate, thrashing dance of survival that was one layer of the torment, a raw and visceral agony. But what happened after? After the hunters, those relentless specks of human determination, finally retreated, perhaps licking their own wounds, or more often, roaring their boisterous, ale-fueled celebrations over a fallen kinsman of mine. After you, if you were one of the infinitesimally lucky ones, had managed to drag your battered, smoking body to some temporary, precarious sanctuary, a hole in the ground that stank of fear and old blood, that's when another kind of suck began to set in, a slower, more insidious corrosion. These were the consequences, the lingering shadows of conflict, the scars. And I don't just speak of the jagged, silvered lines etched across your hide, though those were plentiful enough. I speak of those seared deep within the mind, the spirit, the very essence of what it meant to be dragon. These were the wounds that festered long after the steel had been laboriously, painfully withdrawn, the ones that truly defined the long-term, grinding misery of our persecuted existence. Let's start with the obvious, the tangible, the physical toll. A dragon's hide, as I've mentioned, is a thing of legend, a natural armor forged in the Earth's own furnaces. It can turn aside a common blade, deflect a poorly aimed arrow. But it is not, despite the hopeful pronouncements of younger, more knave dragons, entirely invulnerable. A well-placed spear, particularly one of those thrice damned enchanted abominations, humming with an unnatural energy, could pierce it. A heavy, broad-headed axe, swung with the desperate strength of a man who believes his god is watching, could cleave through scale and into the warm, living flesh beneath. And fire, ironically, our own element, could also bring us harm, especially the unnatural, alchemically enhanced flames some of the more devious human adversaries learned to conjure, sticky, persistent fires that clung and burned with a malevolent intensity. You might survive such an encounter. We were, after all, creatures of immense vitality. But survival often came at a steep, debilitating price. A leg might be permanently lamed, the great muscles torn beyond true repair, the bone shattered and never quite knitting correctly again, leaving you with a grating, painful limp. Therefore, your once powerful ground-eating stride would be reduced to a hobble, a constant, aching reminder of your vulnerability, making escape more difficult, making you an easier, more tempting target for the next inevitable hunt. It was a vicious, self-perpetuating cycle, where each injury compounded your peril, stacking the odds ever further against you. A wing, that magnificent structure of leathery membrane and powerful bone, torn by a wickedly barbed ballista bolt, or shredded by a lucky, desperate sword stroke from a knight who got too close, might never regain its full strength or span. You could still fly, perhaps after a fashion, but no longer with the effortless grace of before, no longer able to dance with the high winds or outmaneuver a storm. Your ascents would be labored, each beat a painful effort. Your dives would be less controlled, your endurance drastically, fatally reduced. Therefore, the skies, once your undisputed dominion, your primary escape route, your very symbol of freedom, became a realm of increased peril, a place where your newfound weakness was cruelly, visibly exposed. The wind that once sang a song of boundless liberty now whispered a constant, mocking reminder of your impairment. It sucked. It truly did, to have your very essence. Your ability to soar above the mundane, to touch the clouds, crippled and diminished by the crude, earthbound violence of lesser beings. And the eyes. Gods. The eyes, those golden, slitted orbs that could perceive the world in a spectrum of light and detail no human could imagine, that could spot a rabbit twitching in the heather from a league away. A single, well-aimed arrow, a sharp shard of shrapnel from an exploding siege engine thrown, with more luck than skill. That's all it often took. To lose an eye was to lose depth perception, to have half your world plunged into a perpetual, confusing twilight. You could adapt, of course. We are, if nothing else, creatures of profound resilience, honed by oons of survival. But that adaptation came with a constant, nagging sense of imbalance, a heightened nerve, jangling vulnerability on your blind side. Therefore, every rustle of leaves in your peripheral vision, every unexpected shadow on that compromised side became a source of heightened alarm, a potential threat you couldn't fully assess, couldn't properly react to. The world, already a hostile and treacherous place, became doubly so, filled with unseen dangers lurking just beyond your impaired senses. These were the visible scars, the ones that other creatures, if any dared to look closely, and few ever dead, might see. They were constant, physical reminders of battles fought, of pain endured, of narrow escapes. But they were also, perversely, beacons. They were advertisements of past encounters, unspoken testimonies to any future hunters. This one has been wounded before. It can be wounded again. Its defenses have been breached. Therefore, your very survival, marked indelibly on your body, became a perverse invitation for further aggression. It was as if carrying the evidence of your resilience, your refusal to die, was, in itself, an unforgivable offense in their eyes. Then, there were the invisible wounds, the ones that burrowed deep into the psyche, far more painful in their own way, far more debilitating in the long, weary run of a hunted life. The constant, grinding stress of being pursued, of never knowing when or where the next attack would come, of existing in a perpetual state of high alert, took its inevitable toll. Sleep, that supposed balm of the weary, became a battlefield of its own, populated by vivid, recurring nightmares, the chilling glint of polished steel in torchlight, the agonized screams of dying kin, the triumphant, bloodthirsty roar of human voices. You jolt awake, heart pounding like a war drum against your ribs, nostrils flaring, convinced the hunters were already at the mouth of your cave, their shadows falling across the entrance, only to find nothing. Just the oppressive silence of the deep earth, the damp chill, and the echoing thud of your own terrified fear. But that nothing was almost worse, because it meant the threat was still out there, unseen, unheard, but ever present, coiling in the darkness. Therefore, rest offered no true respite, only a different, more insidious kind of torment. Peace of mind. That was a forgotten language, a luxury we couldn't even begin to dream of affording. It had been hunted into extinction long, long ago. Paranoia became a constant companion, an unwelcome, clinging shadow that colored your every thought, your every perception. Every snapped twig underfoot, every dislodged pebble skittering down a slope, every bird taking flight in sudden alarm, all were potential harbingers of doom, subtle signs of impending attack. you'd find yourself scrutinizing every minute detail of your surroundings with a desperate intensity, searching for signs of human passage, a broken branch, a faint footprint in the mud, the almost imperceptible scent of wood smoke or metal for the subtle disturbances that indicated you were no longer truly alone. Trust. That word, that concept, ceased to have any meaning in our vocabulary. Every living creature, even those traditionally of no threat, became a potential informant, a scout for the ever-present enemy. The deer that bounded away too quickly from your approach, the raven that circled overhead a little too long, its black eye glinting. Were they innocent bystanders, or were they marking your position for those who followed? But to live in such a state of perpetual, corrosive suspicion, to see potential betrayal in every rustling leaf, in every fleeting shadow, was to live in a mental prison of your own agonizing making, a cage built not of bars, but by the relentless actions of others. Therefore, the world, once a place of wild, untamed beauty, a vibrant tapestry of life, transformed into a treacherous landscape of potential traps and hidden enemies. It sucked the very joy, the very possibility of peace, out of existence, replacing it with a gnawing, pervasive, all-consuming anxiety. Grief. Oh, the grief. It was a vast, bottomless, lightless ocean, and we were forever drowning in its cold, suffocating depths. To witness the brutal, senseless slaughter of your mate, the one with whom you had shared centuries of flight and fire, to see the unholy terror in the eyes of your young as they were run through by human spears, to feel the systematic, inexorable eradication of your kind, one by one. These were not abstract losses, not mere statistics in a forgotten war. These were gaping, ragged wounds in the soul, raw and perpetually bleeding. Wounds that never truly healed, that never truly scarred over. You would carry their memories, the sound of their last terrified cries, the image of their dying gazes, with you always, through every solitary sunrise, through every hunted night. You might find a new den, a new, desolate mountain range to call your temporary home. But those memories, those ghosts, would follow, haunting your waking hours, polluting your dreams with their sorrow. Therefore, every dawn was a fresh reminder of who was no longer there to see it. Every distant sound of the hunt a fresh torment echoing past unbearable losses. The weight of that accumulated sorrow was immense, a crushing, invisible burden that made even the strongest wings feel heavy, that made the thought of another day, another flight, almost too much to bear. How does one continue when so much has been taken, when the future seems to hold nothing but more darkness, more loss? It was a question we asked ourselves daily, etched in the lines of wariness around our ancient eyes, and the answers were seldom, if ever, comforting. And what of rage? What of bitterness? Yes, those too, inevitably. It was almost impossible not to feel a burning, corrosive resentment, a deep-seated, venomous anger at the sheer, screaming injustice of it all. You might have started your long life as a relatively peaceful creature, content to observe the turning of the ages, to live and let live within the natural order. But after decades, or centuries, of unprovoked aggression, of seeing your loved ones slaughtered for sport or for fear, of being hounded from one precarious refuge to another, something inside you was bound to break, or at least to irrevocably harden. Therefore, for some of my kind, this constant, brutal persecution did indeed transform them into the very savage, fire-breathing monsters that humans accused all of us of being. Their hearts, once perhaps capable of a draconic form of gentleness, became calcified by endless betrayal and unbearable loss. Their fire became less a tool of last resort defense and more an outward expression of pure, unadulterated, nihilistic fury. Their roars were no longer warnings, but guttural declarations of hatred for a world that had shown them no mercy. It was a tragic, perfectly executed self-fulfilling prophecy, wasn't it? They feared us, so they hunted us, and in hunting us, they sometimes created the very nightmare they had conjured in their fearful imaginings. It sucked to feel that cold, dark poison seeping into your own heart, to recognize with a chilling clarity that their relentless cruelty was slowly, inexorably eroding your own capacity for anything other than bitterness and a desire for retribution. Loneliness. This, perhaps, was the cruelest, most insidious scar of all, the one that gnawed most persistently at the fraying edges of sanity, especially in the long, silent watches of the night. We were, in our own ancient way, social creatures. We formed deep bonds, often mated for life alias, or for the span of centuries, at least, which for us was much the same, and cared for our young with a fierce, unwavering devotion. But the relentless, genocidal hunting shattered these bonds, scattered our small communities like ashes on the wind, and left any survivors utterly, terrifyingly isolated, adrift in a hostile, uncaring world. To be the last of your line in a particular mountain range, to listen to the wind howl through the empty peaks and know, with a certainty that chilled you to the bone, that there was no other of your kind within 1,000 leagues to share your sorrow, your vigilance, or even a moment of silent companionship that was a unique and terrible desolation. Therefore, even if you managed, through cunning and luck and sheer, bloody-minded endurance, to evade the hunters for a time, you were still condemned to a profound, echoing solitude. The silence of an empty den, once perhaps a comfort, a place of peace, became a torment in itself, amplifying the desolate whispers of your own despair. It sucked, it truly did, to be so utterly, so irrevocably alone, a living relic of a dying age, with no one to even mourn your passing when your long, weary time finally came to an end. This, then, was the lingering aftermath, the true cost of survival. Not the quick, arguably clean death of a warrior in glorious, albeit unwanted, battle, but the slow, agonizing, day-by-day erosion of body, mind, and spirit. It was a life lived perpetually on the razor's edge of existence, where every breath drawn was a small, defiant victory, but every victory was irrevocably tinged with the bitterness of what had been lost, and what was inevitably, relentlessly, still to come. The scars, both seen and unseen, were our constant, unwelcome companions, a brutal, irrefutable testament to why it truly, profoundly, and enduringly sucked to be a dragon in a world so ferociously determined to erase you from its face. Part 4. Beyond the scaly hide, deconstructing the myth. So, we've journeyed through the immediate terror of the hunt, and we've lingered in the desolate landscape of its aftermath, counting the scars, both visible and unseen. You felt the constant, grinding, suck of an existence defined by persecution. But now, I want us to shift our gaze to employ a different lens, or rather, several. For too long, the narrative of dragon versus man has been a monologue, a one-sided tale spun by the victors, or at least by those who held the quills and brushes. It's time to dissect their stories, to hold their truths up to the cold light of reason, and perhaps to expose the self-serving fictions that fueled our extermination. Because to truly understand why it sucked to be us, you must also understand the monumental, often deliberate, misunderstanding that condemned us. Let's start with their favorite accusations, the cornerstones of the evil dragon mythos, shall we? Dragons devour men and livestock. They cry, their voices thick with righteous indignation from the safety of their walled towns. And yes, it is true, we are carnivores. We are large. We require sustenance. But consider this, in a world where human populations were exploding, where forests, our traditional hunting grounds, were being systematically cleared for agriculture, where their ever-expanding herds grazed upon the very lands that once supported wild game. What were we to do? Starve? Fade into oblivion with a polite, draconic apology for our inconvenient existence? When the deer and the wild boar vanish, when the mountainsides are stripped bare, a desperate creature, driven by the primal urge to survive, might indeed turn to easier, albeit more dangerous, prey. Therefore, were these acts of monstrous depredation? Or were they, more often than not, the tragic, predictable consequence of habitat destruction and resource competition initiated by humans themselves? It's a rather different picture when you frame it that way, isn't it? The lion doesn't become evil for taking a gazelle, it simply is. Why were we held to a different, impossible standard? It sucked to be blamed for the inevitable outcomes of their own unchecked expansion. Dragons kidnap fair maidens. Ah, this one is a particular favorite of the balladeers and the young knights eager for a damsel to rescue, say, and subsequently impressed. The image is potent, a beautiful, helpless princess snatched away to a dragon's lair, awaiting a valiant hero. But let's apply a touch of logic here, however unpalatable it may be to the romantics. What conceivable use would a creature like myself, ancient, solitary, and decidedly non-humanoid, have for a human female? For companionship? Unlikely, given the rather significant communication barriers and, shall we say, lifestyle incompatibilities. As a food source? Possible, in dire straits, but humans are stringy, bony, and generally less appetizing than a plump mountain goat. The kidnapped princess trope, I suspect, served a far more human purpose. It provided a perfect, emotionally charged casus belli, a noble pretext for launching an attack, for claiming a heroic victory, and, not incidentally, for plundering any hoard that might be conveniently discovered in the process. Therefore, how many of these supposed abductions were genuine, and how many were elaborate fabrications, or perhaps misinterpretations of a young woman who, heaven forbid, might have wandered off on her own, or even eloped with a less than princely suitor, with the blame conveniently shifted to the nearest, most fearsome local inhabitant. It sucked to be the default villain in every domestic drama and political maneuver. Dragons lay waste to villages with fire and fury. The image of a dragon, wings black against a smoke hate-filled sky, raining down destruction upon hapless hamlets, is a powerful one, designed to instill maximum terror. And yes, our breath is fire, and yes, when cornered, when attacked, when our lairs were threatened, we fought back with everything we had. But how often was this unprovoked? Destruction truly unprovoked. How many of these villages were built too close to ancient nesting sites, their inhabitants knowingly or unknowingly encroaching upon territories that had been ours for millennia? How many times was a fiery retaliation a direct response to a band of armed men sent by that very village, attempting to drive us out or steal salor, non-existent treasures? Therefore, was it wanton destruction, or was it, in many instances, desperate self-defense? Or perhaps the tragic collateral damage of a battle initiated by humans, with the dragon simply being the more visibly destructive combatant? The narrative rarely includes the initial provocation, does it? It only ever shows the fiery retort. It sucked to have your every act of self-preservation painted as an act of pure, unadulterated malice. Now, let's turn our gaze to the heroes of these tales, the valiant dragon slayers. Clad in their shining armor, their banners snapping in the wind, they rode forth to protect the innocent and vanquish evil. A noble calling on the surface. But what truly motivated them? Was it always pure altruism? Or was it, more often, a thirst for glory, a desire for fame and fortune that could only be quenched by the slaying of a magnificent, terrible beast? The bigger the dragon, the greater the renown. The more ferocious its reputation, a reputation often built on hearsay and exaggeration, the more heroic the slayer. And let's not forget the material rewards. The king's gratitude, a noble title, perhaps the hand of that. Rescued princess, and, of course, a hefty share of the dragons. Entirely mythical, in most cases hoard. Therefore, was their quest truly about eradicating a threat, or was it about self-aggrandizement, a violent career path paved with our bones and scales? It's a less flattering portrait, but perhaps a more accurate one. Consider the methods employed by these champions of light. Was it always honorable, face-to-face combat, skill against skill? Rarely. More often, it involved trickery, ambush, and the exploitation of any perceived weakness. They would study our habits, learn our flight paths, identify our dens. They would use poisoned bait, set cunning traps, or attack when we were sleeping or otherwise vulnerable. They would employ enchanted weapons, blessed by priests who conveniently declared us soulless abominations, thus sanctioning any and all methods of our destruction. But where is the honor in slaying a creature through deceit, or by attacking its young to draw it into a fatal confrontation? Where is the valor in a dozen armed men setting upon a single, albeit powerful, opponent? Therefore, their heroism often looks suspiciously like calculated and sometimes cowardly extermination when viewed from the other side of the spear. It sucked to be hunted by those who cloaked their brutality in the mantle of righteousness. And what was lost in this relentless, one-sided war? What potential was extinguished with every slain dragon? We were, as I've said, ancient beings. We carried within us the memory of ages, a deep, intuitive understanding of the natural world that humans, in their short, frenetic lives, could barely comprehend. We understood the delicate balance of ecosystems, the ebbs and flow of natural energies. We were, in our own way, living libraries of forgotten lore, of geological time, of celestial patterns. But who among them ever sought to learn from us, to listen to the wisdom that might have been shared? Who ever considered that we might be more than just fearsome beasts to be conquered? Therefore, with each life they took, they were not just killing an individual. They were burning a unique, irreplaceable volume from the great library of the world. They were silencing a voice that might have offered insights, warnings, or even, dare I say, a different kind of companionship, had they only possessed the courage and humility to seek it. Imagine a world where that fear had been overcome, where curiosity had outweighed prejudice. Perhaps we could have been guardians, not just of remote mountain passes, but of ancient knowledge. Perhaps our understanding of the Earth's deep currents could have aided them in ways they never imagined. Perhaps our longevity could have offered a unique perspective on their own fleeting societal struggles. But such possibilities were never explored. The narrative of monster was too deeply ingrained, too convenient, too profitable for those who built their careers and kingdoms upon our demise. Therefore, a potential symbiosis, a relationship of mutual, if wearied, respect, was sacrificed on the altar of fear and ambition. It sucked, not just for us, but for the world they were shaping. A world that became a little poorer, a little less magical, with every dragon that fell from the sky. The very stories they told, the ones that painted us as irredeemably evil, served to perpetuate the cycle. Children grew up hearing these tales, their young minds absorbing the fear and hatred as absolute truth. But a story is a powerful thing. It can shape perception, define reality, and justify actions, however heinous. Therefore, by controlling the narrative, by ensuring that only one version of the dragon was ever presented, they guaranteed that each new generation would take up the spear and the torch with the same unquestioning conviction as the last. Our true nature, our potential for anything other than monstrousness, was never allowed to enter the public consciousness. It was a masterful, if unconscious, campaign of demonization, and we were its ultimate victims. It sucked to be trapped not just by steel nets and sharpened lances, but by the invisible, unyielding chains of a story not of our making. And that, perhaps, was the cruelest hunt of all. Part 5. Echoes in the modern world, the dragon in the mirror. We've traversed a desolate landscape of fear, pursuit, and pain. We've dissected the myths, questioned the motives, and counted the scars, both on the scaled hide and deep within the ancient soul. You've hopefully begun to grasp, in some small measure, why it so profoundly, so comprehensively, sucked to be a dragon in a world that had declared you anathema. But if this were merely a lament for a lost, fantastical species, a dirge for a bygone age of myth and magic, then our journey together would be a bleak one indeed, a mere exercise in vicarious suffering. Therefore, I ask you now to lift your gaze from the smoldering ruins of a dragon's lair and look around you at your own world, at your own time. For the echoes of our story, the dynamics that led to our persecution, are far from extinct. They resonate still, in surprisingly familiar, and often equally painful ways. The dragon and the knight are not just figures of fantasy. They are archetypes, patterns of behavior that persist in the human heart and human society. Consider the phenomenon your scholars call othering. It's a rather clinical term for a deeply insidious process, the act of defining a group as fundamentally different, as alien, as not us, and therefore as inherently lesser, suspect, or even dangerous. This was the very bedrock of our persecution. We were scaled, not smooth-skinned. We flew, while they were bound to the earth. We possessed ancient power they could neither comprehend nor control. But these differences, in themselves, were not inherently malevolent. They were simply differences. Yet, it was upon these differences that the entire edifice of dragon as monster was constructed. Therefore, fear of the unknown, coupled with a desire for dominance or security, transformed simple variance into a justification for prejudice, for hatred, and ultimately, for violence. Now, look at your world. Do you not see this same mechanism at play? Individuals or entire groups singled out because of the color of their skin, the god they worship or don't worship, the person they love, the land of their birth, their political affiliations, or even the economic circumstances into which they were born. They are labeled the immigrant, the refugee, the heretic, the radical, the undeserving poor. These labels, like the monster tag pinned upon us, serve to dehumanize, to strip away individuality and shared humanity, making it easier to justify discrimination, to ignore suffering, or even to perpetrate acts of cruelty. It sucks, doesn't it, to be reduced to a caricature, to have your worth judged not by the content of your character, but by a label slapped upon you by a fearful or ignorant majority. That was our daily bread, that bitter taste of being pre-judged and pre-condemned. And what of the power of narrative, the stories that shape perception? We dragons had no bards to sing our sagas, no scholars to record our histories from our perspective. Our story was told for us, by those who hunted us. And in their tales, we were always the villains, our motives always malevolent, our destruction always justified. But a story, as I've said, is a weapon or a shield, depending on who wields it. The dominant narrative rarely favors the marginalized. Therefore, how many truths in your world are simply the accepted version of events propagated by those in power, while the voices of the dragons, the oppressed, the misunderstood, the silenced are drowned out or dismissed as mere noise, as the incoherent roaring of monsters? Think of the media you consume, the histories you are taught. Whose voices are amplified? Whose are muted? Are there dragons in your society whose stories are being deliberately distorted, whose complexities are being flattened into simplistic, fear-inducing stereotypes? It sucks to have your reality denied, your experiences invalidated, your very identity shaped by those who wish you ill or simply cannot be bothered to understand. It's a fight for narrative control, a battle we dragons lost spectacularly, and one that continues to be fought every single day in your own time. The dragon's hoard, that potent symbol of greed that cost so many of us our lives. We were accused of coveting what was not ours, of amassing wealth for its own sake. But as we explored, this was largely a catastrophic misunderstanding, a projection of human avarice onto us. Therefore, we were hunted for a sin we did not commit. Our lairs ransacked for treasures that were often just the detritus of forgotten ages, or, ironically, loot hidden by other humans. Does this not find its echo in your world? Consider how often blame for societal ills, poverty, unemployment, resource scarcity is laid at the feet of the vulnerable, the other. Immigrants are accused of stealing jobs, minorities of draining resources, the poor of laziness. Yet, are these not often convenient scapegoats? Dragons, created to distract from deeper, more systemic issues, from the greed or mismanagement of those who truly hold power and wealth. It sucks to be blamed for problems you did not create, to be made the target of a frustration whose true source lies elsewhere. And the knights, the valiant heroes who rode out to slay us. We saw how their motives were often a complex mix of genuine zekris, if misguided conviction, a thirst for glory, and a desire for material gain. But the idea of the knight, the righteous crusader against evil, is a powerful and enduring one. Therefore, it is an archetype that can be, and often is, co-opted. In your world, who are the self-proclaimed knights? Who are the ones declaring certain groups or ideas evil and calling for their metaphorical or sometimes literal eradication? Are their motives always as pure as they claim? Do they truly seek to protect the innocent, or are they, perhaps, serving their own agendas, consolidating their own power, or simply pandering to the fears of their followers? It sucks to be on the receiving end of a crusade, especially when you know the crusaders are driven by something far less noble than they profess. The certainty of the self-righteous knight is a terrifying thing to face, whether you have scales or skin. So, what is the lesson in all this ancient pain, this chronicle of why it sucked so profoundly to be a dragon? Is it merely to despair at the cyclical nature of prejudice and misunderstanding? No. That would be a disservice to the memory of my kind, and, more importantly, a disservice to your own potential for growth. The true lesson, the one I hope you carry away from this echoing cavern of shared experience, is about the transformative power of empathy, of critical thinking, and of courage. Empathy is the ability to step, however briefly, into another's scales or skin. It is the willingness to try and see the world from a perspective that is not your own, especially when that perspective belongs to someone you have been taught to fear or despise. Had even one human, one knight, one king, truly attempted to understand why a dragon might act as it did, not out of malice, but out of fear or hunger or a desperate instinct for self-preservation, perhaps our story might have been different. But empathy requires effort. It requires a quieting of one's own certainties and a willingness to listen, truly listen, to the roar of the other, and to discern the pain, the fear, or the plea for understanding that might lie beneath it. Therefore, I implore you, before you cast judgment, before you accept a convenient label, before you join the chorus of condemnation against any dragon in your midst, try to walk a mile in their shadow. Critical thinking is the courage to question the narratives you are fed, to dissect the truths that are presented as unassailable. Just as the tales of gold hoarding, maiden-snatching dragons were fictions designed to justify a brutal reality, so too are many of an harmful stereotypes and prejudices in your world built upon layers of misinformation, exaggeration, and deliberate distortion. But to challenge these narratives requires intellectual honesty and a willingness to be uncomfortable, to admit that what you thought you knew might be wrong. Therefore, examine the source of the stories you hear. Ask who benefits from this particular version of events. Seek out the silenced voices, the perspectives that have been deliberately excluded. Be a critical consumer of information, not a passive recipient. And courage. Not the blustering courage of the dragon, slayer, eager for glory, but a quieter, more profound courage. The courage to stand against the tide of popular opinion when you know it is unjust. The courage to defend the dragon when it is easier and safer to join the mob. The courage to admit your own biases and to work to overcome them. The courage to choose compassion over fear, understanding over condemnation. But this courage is not always easy to find. It often means risking ridicule, ostracization, or even worse. Therefore, it is perhaps the rarest and most precious quality of all. Our story, the story of why it sucked to be a dragon, is a tragedy. But it does not have to be a blueprint for your future. You have the capacity, as sentient beings, to learn from the mistakes of the past, both real and imagined. You have the ability to choose a different path. You can choose to see the other, not as a monster to be feared and destroyed, but as a fellow traveler, a being with their own story, their own pain, their own inherent worth. Therefore, let our ancient sorrow be a catalyst for your modern wisdom. Let the echoes of our extinguished roars remind you to listen more closely to the whispers of the marginalized in your own time. Perhaps, then, the true hoard we dragons guarded was not gold or jewels, but this very lesson that the greatest treasure is not to be found in conquest or domination, but in understanding, in empathy, in the courageous recognition of shared being, even across the deepest chasms of difference. It sucked to be us, because those who hunted us lacked these treasures. May you, in your time, prove to be far, far richer. Conclusion. And so, our journey through the shadowed valleys of draconic despair nears its end. We have felt the biting wind of relentless pursuit, the searing pain of unjust wounds, the cold ache of profound loneliness, and the crushing weight of a narrative, not of our making. You have heard, I hope, not just the roar of a mythical beast, but the anguished cry of a being pushed to the very brink, a testament to why it so comprehensively, so soul-crushingly, sucked to be a dragon in a world that had condemned us before we'd even drawn our first fiery breath. We were magnificent, yes, ancient, powerful, and keepers of a wisdom that spanned epochs. But our magnificence became our curse, our power the pretext for our slaughter, our wisdom a silent, solitary burden. We were hunted not for what we did, but for what we were, for the fear we inspired in hearts too small to accommodate anything so vastly different, so untamably other. Do therefore. Our story is etched in scars, written in the ashes of our lairs, and whispered on the winds that now sweep through empty mountain peaks where once our shadows danced. It is a chronicle of misunderstanding, of prejudice, and of a profound, tragic failure of empathy. But, and this, perhaps, is the most important, but of all, this tale of ancient woe is not offered to you as a shroud of despair, nor as a final, futile lament. It is offered as a mirror. Look into it. See the reflections of your own world, your own time. See the dragons who walk among you, the misunderstood, the marginalized, the feared, the othered, those whose stories are silenced or twisted, those who bear the weight of labels not of their choosing. See, too, the knights, those who, in certainty or in ignorance, wield the spears of judgment, driven by fear, by ambition, or by the seductive call of a simplistic narrative. The mechanics of prejudice, the dynamics of fear, the power of a controlling story, these are not relics of a mythical past. They are alive, breathing, and shaping your realities even now. Do therefore, the echoes of our extinction carry a vital, urgent message for you. Unlike the dragons of old, trapped in a destiny forged by human fear, you possess a power we never dead. The power of conscious choice, the capacity for profound collective change. You can choose to break the cycle. You can choose to lay down the spears of easy condemnation and instead extend the hand of difficult understanding. You can choose to listen, truly listen, beyond the roar, beyond the scales, beyond the fear, to the shared heartbeat of existence that connects all living things. This, then, is the last dab, the final ember I wish to leave glowing in your consciousness. The story of why it sucked to be a dragon is not merely a sorrowful legend. It is an eternal reminder of the devastating cost of ignorance, the savage cruelty of prejudice, and the profound, healing power of compassion. But unlike the dragons of lore, you are not bound by an ancient, tragic script. You hold the quill. You have the agency. You can choose to be the knights who rush in with swords of judgment, perpetuating fear and division. Or you can choose to be the seekers of truth, the listeners to silent roars, the champions of the misunderstood, recognizing that sometimes the most fearsome monster is not the one with claws and fangs, but the fear, the apathy, and the prejudice that reside within the human heart itself. Do therefore, let the long extinguished roar of my kind awaken the empathy within yours. Let our sorrow fuel your courage to write a new song for your world, a song of understanding, of acceptance, of fierce and defiant hope for all the dragons, great and small, still hiding in the shadows of your time. Look closer. Listen deeper. Choose compassion, not fear. For in the end, the only horde worth fighting for is a world where it doesn't have to suck to be different.
you.